9-year-old girl, about to give birth, but doctors uncover a shocking secret? The hospital halls echoed with whispers and judgment, but nobody knew the real story. What the doctors found next would silence every accusation. The rain crashed down over the city like a relentless force, each heavy drop pounding against the hospital's overhanging roof in a mournful rhythm. The biting wind cut through everything in its path, scattering dead leaves and dust across the soaked pavement. The emergency lights painted the wet ground in an otherworldly dance of red and blue, their reflections shimmering like spectral patterns on the rain-slicked surface. Sirens wailed through the darkness, their urgent cry tearing through the night, blending with the steady drumbeat of rain and the hurried footsteps of medical staff rushing to their duties. Paul burst through the hospital doors, carrying Maya in his arms. Rain dripped from his soaked coat and matted hair. His shoes slipped on the wet floor, but he caught his balance quickly. His worried eyes darted around the busy waiting room, searching for help. Every second felt like an eternity as he held her close. His face showed raw fear. His lips were pressed tight, his breathing heavy. His dark eyes held a desperate look, telling everyone that time was running against them. Every moment that passed seemed to weigh heavier on his shoulders. He rushed to the reception desk, his voice breaking. "Please, she needs help. Right now, she's not well. Thousands of people." His hands gripped Maya's shoulders tightly, afraid she might disappear if he let go. The fear in his voice made everyone turn and stare. Even as nurses approached, he couldn't bring himself to loosen his protective hold on her. The waiting room fell into a sudden silence. Every head turned toward Paul and Maya, the usual hospital noise dying away like a held breath. A man in a gray suit furrowed his brow, breaking the silence. "What's going on here?" His voice carried across the now quiet room. A woman nearby stumbled backward, her handbag falling to the floor with a thud. "That child, she's pregnant," she stammered, her face pale with shock. Whispers began to ripple through the crowd like waves in a disturbed pond. "Who could do such a thing?" someone murmured. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. "It must be him. Look at him." Another voice joined in. "He's the one responsible." The accusation spread faster now, gaining momentum with each passing second. A woman with silver-streaked hair pulled out her phone, her hands shaking with anger. "Everyone needs to see this," she declared, her voice trembling with outrage. "This is a crime." The tension in the room built like a gathering storm. More people stood up from their seats, their faces twisted with disgust and anger. A tall man with broad shoulders stepped forward, his face flushed red with fury. "What have you done to this little girl?" he demanded, his voice booming across the room. "Don't you realize you deserve punishment? I came to see my friends, but you dragged everyone along with you." Someone shouted from the back, "We can't let him get away with this." A small boy tugged at his mother's sleeve, pointing at Maya with innocent curiosity. "Mommy, what's wrong with that girl?" he asked, his clear voice cutting through the angry murmurs. His mother quickly pulled him close, turning his face away. "Don't look, sweetie," she whispered, but loud enough for those nearby to hear. "This isn't something for children to see." An elderly man sitting in a corner shook his head slowly, his weathered face lined with disapproval. "What kind of world are we living in?" he muttered. The crowd's reaction spread like wildfire, transforming the normally peaceful waiting room into a court of judgment. More phones appeared, recording the scene. The whispers became heated discussions, then angry declarations. Some people moved closer, their faces showing a mix of horror and morbid fascination. Others backed away, as if afraid to be associated with what they were witnessing. The air grew thick with tension and unspoken accusations. Medical staff at the reception desk exchanged worried glances, their usual professional calm wavering in the face of this unprecedented situation. A security guard near the entrance shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to intervene. The automatic doors kept opening and closing as new patients arrived. Each newcomer quickly caught up in the growing drama, adding their own shocked reactions to the mounting chaos. Through it all, Paul stood holding Maya, becoming the center of a storm of judgment and condemnation while the rain continued to pour outside, matching the dark mood that had descended upon the hospital waiting room. Maya writhed in pain, each wave of agony tearing through her small body like shards of glass. Her stomach felt hard as stone, and her tiny hands clutched desperately at Paul's wet coat. With each passing moment, she could feel her strength ebbing away, like water slipping through her fingers. Her eyes, glazed with pain, searched the crowded room weakly, looking for any sign of help. Through pale lips, she whispered a desperate prayer only Paul could hear. "Paul, don't let me lose my baby. Please." Her voice trembled with fear and exhaustion, each word a struggle to form. Her next words were so faint that Paul had to lean closer to hear them. I can't bear it anymore." Tears rolled down her cheeks, mixing with the cold rainwater on her pale face. Each breath came as a shallow gasp, her small frame shaking with the effort to stay conscious. The pain seemed to consume her entire world, leaving room for nothing else but the desperate need to protect the life growing inside her. Despite her adult mind, her childlike body seemed too fragile to contain such suffering. The harsh surgical lights blazed down on the cold metal operating table, casting sharp shadows across the emergency room. The steady beep of the monitor marked time like a ticking clock, occasionally racing with Maya's irregular heartbeat. The sound filled the room with its urgent rhythm, a constant reminder of the precarious situation. Dr. David stood in the center of the chaos, his white rubber gloves gleaming under the intense lights. The noise of medical equipment surrounded him, but his focus remained absolute. "Check her blood pressure," he commanded, his voice cutting through the mechanical din. "She's losing blood." He turned sharply to another nurse. "Prepare the surgical tools. We're running out of time." Nurses rushed back and forth across the room, their faces tight with concern. Medical instruments clattered on metal trays as they hurried to prepare everything needed. A young nurse, arranging surgical tools with trembling hands, whispered to her colleague, "Is she really pregnant? How can such a small body handle this surgery?" Her colleague shook her head, eyes wide with disbelief. "She's so tiny. She doesn't look like an adult at all." Dr. David glanced at Maya on the operating table, a flicker of doubt crossing his experienced face. Something about this case didn't add up. In his 30 years of practice, he'd never seen anything quite like this. The patient's body was impossibly small, yet here she was, clearly in labor. "There's something unusual here," he thought, his mind racing through possibilities. "This body, it's different from anything I've encountered before." The urgency in the room intensified as Maya's vital signs fluctuated. The monitor's beeping grew more erratic, spurring everyone into faster action. Time seemed to compress in the small space, each second critical in the fight to save both mother and child. Maya whimpered with each broken breath. Pain burned through her entire body like fire. Her tiny hands gripped the white sheets, leaving pale red marks where her fingers dug in. Everything hurt, every movement bringing fresh waves of agony. She tried to turn, seeking any position of comfort. The restraints and IV tubes held her still. A sudden, sharp pain shot through her stomach. She screamed out in desperation, "No, please, save my baby." The words tore from her throat, raw with fear. Her eyes searched the room frantically. All she could see were masked faces, strange and cold, none of them familiar, none of them comforting. She felt lost in a sea of strangers, drowning in her fear and pain. The medical equipment beeped steadily around her, an alien chorus to her suffering. "Paul!" she sobbed softly. "Is he here?" Her voice was barely a whisper, lost in the clinical sounds of the operating room. She needed him there, needed one person who understood, who knew her story. With shaking fingers, Maya touched her swollen belly. "My darling," she whispered to her unborn child, "Mommy won't let you go. No matter how much it hurts, I'll protect you." Tears rolled down her cheeks as she made this promise. The cold sound of surgical tools being prepared filled the room. Metal clinked against metal. But Maya kept her focus on her baby, on the life she carried. Her body might be small, might look like a child's, but her heart held all the strength of a mother's love. Each moment brought new pain, but she endured. She had to stay strong, had to keep fighting for her baby, for herself. Even as the pain threatened to overwhelm her, she held on to that one thought: protect her child. Dr. David began the C-section procedure with practiced movements. Then he stopped suddenly. His eyes narrowed, focusing on a faint scar at the base of Maya's neck. Something wasn't right. "Wait," he commanded sharply. "Look at this scar. This isn't from a normal accident." He leaned closer, examining the mark. "This looks like surgical work, complex surgery. But why would anyone perform such an operation on a child?" The surgery continued deeper. Dr. David's eyes widened in surprise. Maya's internal organs caught his full attention. They weren't what he expected. Not at all. "This is remarkable," he said to his assistant. "Look here. These organs, they're fully developed. Adult organs." He shook his head in disbelief. "Everything inside is completely normal for a grown woman, some even healthier than average." He turned to his team, gesturing with his gloved hand. "See for yourself. The external appearance suggests a child, but internally..." He paused, searching for words. "This is a fully mature woman's body." A young nurse peered closer. Could it be some kind of mutation?" she asked, her voice uncertain. The question hung in the air, unanswered. Dr. David stopped for a moment. His 30 years of medical experience hadn't prepared him for this. He stared at Maya's open surgical site, his mind racing through possibilities. None made sense. "In all my years," he said slowly, "I've never seen anything like this." His voice carried the weight of professional concern. "We'll need to investigate further, but right now..." He looked at the monitors tracking Maya's vitals. "Right now, our priority is saving both mother and child." The surgical team exchanged glances. The mystery of Maya's condition would have to wait. The beeping monitors reminded them that time was critical, lives hung in the balance. Dr. David refocused on the task at hand. Questions could come later. Now was time for action. His hands moved with renewed purpose, determined to solve one challenge at a time. The emergency room fell silent. Dr. David placed his hands on Maya's stomach, ready for the final moment. The tension was thick in the air. "Clean towels ready," he ordered. "We can't risk any infection." Seconds ticked by like hours. Everyone held their breath. Then, with skilled movements, Dr. David began the delivery. The baby's first cry pierced the silence. Strong and clear, it echoed through the room. The sound washed away all the tension, all the fear. A young nurse wiped tears from her eyes, laughing with joy. "He's healthy! It's a miracle!" Relief spread across the room like a wave. Smiles appeared behind surgical masks. The baby's cries grew stronger, full of life and vigor. The medical staff moved quickly, efficiently, checking the newborn's vital signs. Maya struggled to open her eyes. Though exhausted, she turned her head toward her baby's cries. Tears rolled down her cheeks, but she was smiling. "Ah, my baby," she whispered. "Is he safe?" A nurse gently squeezed her shoulder. "Yes, Maya, he's perfect. Both of you are safe now." She helped Maya catch a glimpse of her son, tiny but strong, still announcing his arrival to the world. The baby's cries softened as nurses cleaned and wrapped him. His little fists waved in the air, his face scrunched up with the effort of his first breaths. Despite her exhaustion, Maya couldn't take her eyes off him. Dr. David watched the scene while completing the surgery. His mind was full of questions about Maya's condition. But seeing mother and child together, hearing those healthy cries, he knew the mystery could wait. This moment belonged to Maya and her son. "Your son is strong," he told Maya softly, "just like his mother." Maya's smile grew wider, even as her eyes began to close from exhaustion. The sound of her baby's cries was the sweetest lullaby she could imagine. The usual chaos of the waiting room froze the moment Paul entered with Maya in his arms. Like a ripple in still water, heads turned one by one. Eyes widened, whispers began. The fluorescent lights seemed to grow harsher, highlighting every detail of the strange scene before them. A middle-aged woman near the entrance was the first to break the silence. She sat up straighter, her hand flying to her mouth. "That child! She's pregnant! How is this possible?" Her voice trembled, drawing more stares. A young man leaning against the wall let out a bitter laugh. The whispers spread like smoke through the room. "Look at him," someone hissed. "There's something suspicious about him." Another voice joined in, stronger, angrier. "He must be the father. He should be arrested." The accusations floated through the air, growing bolder with each passing moment. A woman with graying hair pulled out her phone, her fingers shaking slightly as she held it up. "We need to record this," she whispered to those around her. "People like him need to be exposed." The blue light from her screen cast eerie shadows on her determined face. The weight of their stares pressed against Paul's back like cold steel. An elderly man rose slowly from his seat, his brows furrowed in concern. "Someone should call the police," he announced, his voice carrying authority earned from years of life. "This isn't right. This isn't normal." Near the corner, a mother pulled her young child closer to her side. Her eyes darted nervously between Paul and the exit. "Don't look, sweetheart," she murmured, turning her child's face away. "Mommy doesn't want you to see this." Her words carried clear across the now silent room, heavy with implication. The air grew thick with judgment. Each breath seemed to draw in more suspicion, more certainty of wrongdoing. The usual sounds of the hospital, phones ringing, papers shuffling, doors opening and closing, faded into background noise against the mounting tension. Everyone watched, everyone waited, as if expecting the truth to reveal itself in the next moment. Paul moved slowly through the crowded room, each step measured and deliberate. His arms cradled Maya protectively, holding her close against the storm of whispers. Sweat mingled with rain on his forehead, trickling down his tense face. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows under his eyes, highlighting his exhaustion. The murmurs swirled around him like autumn leaves, but he remained focused. His eyes scanned the room methodically, searching for medical staff. Someone's phone camera flashed. He didn't flinch. A child pointed. He didn't turn. Every ounce of his attention remained fixed on finding help for Maya. Fear flickered in his dark eyes, but not from the accusing stares that followed his every move. His gaze kept darting to Maya's pale face, then to the emergency room doors. Each second felt like an eternity. The clock on the wall seemed to mock him with its slow ticking. Time refused to move faster, no matter how desperately he wished it would. A young man stepped into his path, shoulders squared and jaw set. Paul simply shifted slightly, moving around him like water flowing past a stone. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. "Please, save her first. I'll explain everything later." The weight of truth in his words made the man step back, uncertainty replacing his previous conviction. Inside, Paul felt every stare like a physical weight. Each whispered accusation pressed against his shoulders, each shocked gasp cut like a knife. But he kept moving forward. In his mind, he repeated a simple truth. They don't understand. Only Maya and the baby matter now. The emergency room doors loomed ahead, promising help but seeming impossibly far away. Paul tightened his hold on Maya slightly, feeling her shallow breaths against his chest. Nothing else mattered. Not the phones recording him, not the security guard approaching, not the growing chorus of concerned voices. His world had narrowed to two things: reaching those doors and keeping Maya safe. A middle-aged man pushed through the crowd, his face flushed with rage. He stood before Paul, fists clenched at his sides. "What have you done to this little girl?" His voice shook with anger. "You think you can get away with this?" The man's hand shot forward, reaching for Paul's collar. A security guard appeared just in time, catching the man's arm mid-swing. The guard's blue uniform flashed under the fluorescent lights as he stepped between them. But the man wasn't finished. He struggled against the guard's grip, his voice rising to a shout. "I can't believe this," he thrashed harder, pointing at Maya. "A child! How can you let a child suffer like this?" His words echoed off the sterile walls, drawing more attention. Other patients rose from their seats, their voices joining the chorus of outrage. The waiting room erupted into chaos. Paul took 2 careful steps backward, still cradling Maya protectively. His movements were slow, deliberate. He met the angry man's gaze steadily, his voice low and controlled. "I've done nothing wrong," he said clearly. "But now isn't the time for explanations." His calm seemed to fuel the crowd's anger even more. More people stood up. Voices overlapped. Phones recorded. The security guard called for backup on his radio. Through it all, Paul remained still, like the eye of a storm. His only movement was to adjust his hold on Maya, keeping her secure against his chest as the chaos swirled around them. The sharp sound of boots on linoleum cut through the chaos. 2 police officers strode into the waiting room, their uniforms dark against the sterile white walls. The taller officer raised his hand, his voice carrying authority. "Everyone calm down. We're here to handle this." The younger officer approached Paul, his eyes conducting a quick assessment from head to toe. His hand rested casually on his belt as he spoke. "Sir, we need you to come with us. There are some questions we need to ask." His tone left no room for argument. "Right now." His partner turned to the agitated man who had tried to attack Paul, speaking in measured tones. "Sir, please remain calm. We'll investigate this thoroughly." The man's shoulders slumped, but anger still burned in his eyes. Paul's gaze drifted toward the emergency room doors, worry etched deep in his features. He stood perfectly still, only his eyes moving as he watched the medical staff hurrying past. When he spoke, his voice was steady despite the tension. "I'll cooperate," he said quietly, "but please, make sure Maya is taken care of first." One of the officers nodded, gesturing toward the exit. Paul followed their lead, his steps measured and calm. The crowd parted before them, their faces a mix of suspicion and judgment. Whispers followed him down the corridor. Phones still recorded his departure. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows as they walked. 3 figures moving through the sterile hallway. 2 blue uniforms flanking a man whose shoulders remained straight despite the weight of accusations bearing down on him. Maya's eyelids fluttered open, then quickly closed against the bright sunlight streaming through the window. The steady beeping of the monitor beside her bed created a rhythmic backdrop to the soft footsteps of nurses in the hallway. She tried opening her eyes again, slower this time, letting them adjust to the harsh fluorescent glare. A dull ache pulsed through her body, centering in her abdomen like a hot coal. She attempted to shift position, seeking comfort, but stopped instantly as sharp pain shot through her. The IV tubes rustled against crisp white sheets. Her small hands trembled as they moved to her stomach, touching gently, searching for reassurance. The memory of recent events began filtering back through the haze of pain medication. Her throat felt dry, her voice emerging as a hoarse whisper. "Paul!" She swallowed hard, trying again. "Where's Paul? Is he all right?" The words scraped against her throat like sandpaper. A young nurse appeared at her bedside, adjusting the IV drip with careful movements. Her voice was gentle, sympathetic. "Paul was taken by the police. They needed to ask him some questions." She paused, smoothing Maya's blanket. "He wanted me to tell you everything will be okay." Oh. Tears welled up in Maya's eyes, rolling down her temples into her hair. "No," she whispered, her voice breaking. "He didn't do anything wrong." Her fingers clutched at the blanket weakly. "Paul was only trying to help me." The monitor's beeping increased slightly with her distress. The nurse placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Try to stay calm," she murmured. "Focus on recovering." But Maya's thoughts remained with Paul, imagining him facing accusations alone. More tears fell as she whispered again, barely audible, "He only wanted to help." The morning light continued to stream through the window, painting patterns on the hospital floor as Maya struggled between physical pain and emotional turmoil, the monitor's steady beeping marking time in the quiet room. Maya gathered her strength, meeting Dr. David's eyes as he checked her vital signs. The morning light softened his features, making him seem more approachable. She took a shallow breath. "I have Laron syndrome," she began quietly. "It's a rare condition that keeps my body small, like a child's, but inside I'm fully grown." Her fingers twisted in the sheets as she continued. 26 years, that's how long I've lived with people judging me by my appearance." She paused, drawing another careful breath. "They see a child when they look at me. They don't understand that I'm a woman, just like any other." Dr. David sat down beside her bed, his clipboard forgotten in his lap. "Tell me about the scar," he said gently. "The one at the base of your skull. It's unusual." His fingers moved slightly, as if wanting to examine it again. Maya nodded slowly, her hand unconsciously moving to touch the old mark. "I was 12 when they found the tumor," she explained. "Benign, thankfully, but it was pressing against my spinal cord." Her voice grew softer, remembering. "The surgery took 8 hours. They said it was successful, but it left its mark." Tears gathered in her eyes, but she blinked them away. People see the scar, see my size, and they make assumptions. They never ask who I really am. The monitor's steady beeping punctuated her words. They never wait to learn my story. Dr. David listened intently, his expression shifting from professional interest to deep understanding. He noticed how her small hands moved with adult grace, how her eyes held years of wisdom despite her youthful face. The medical puzzle pieces were falling into place. "The internal scans make sense now," he said thoughtfully. "Your organs are fully developed, healthy even. Everything inside matches your true age." He made a few notes in her chart, then looked up with newfound respect. "You've carried this burden for a long time." Maya managed a weak smile. "The physical differences I can handle. It's the judgment that weighs heaviest." She shifted slightly, wincing at the movement. "Thank you for listening, doctor, for seeing me as I am." Dr. David stood, adjusting her IV with careful movements. "You need rest now," he said firmly but kindly. "Your body has been through a lot." He turned to leave, but paused as Maya spoke again. "Doctor," she called softly, "there's more you need to know." Her voice held a quiet determination despite her exhaustion. The morning sun caught the tears in her eyes, making them shine with an almost ethereal light as she prepared to tell him the rest of her story. Maya's voice softened as she spoke of Jack, her eyes distant with memory. "Jack was different," she whispered. "He was the first person who saw me as a woman, not a curiosity." Her fingers traced invisible patterns on the hospital blanket as she remembered. "I met him in a small coffee shop. He played guitar there on weekends. I would sit in the corner, listening to him play." A faint smile touched her lips. "One day, he caught me sketching him. Instead of being upset, he smiled and came to my table. 'That's a beautiful drawing,' he said, 'but your smile would be even more beautiful.'" Her cheeks flushed at the memory, a hint of happiness breaking through her exhaustion. "After that, we met more often. He never treated me like I was different. He said I was special because I was me, not because of my condition. He made me forget about all the stares, all the whispers." The afternoon sun painted warm patterns across her bed as she continued. "He proposed by the lake one sunny day. He didn't have a real ring, just one he'd woven from grass stems. He knelt down and said, 'We'll face everything together.'" Her voice cracked slightly. "He promised we'd never be alone." Tears rolled down her cheeks now unchecked. But fate had other plans. 8 months ago, a car accident. She closed her eyes, fighting for composure. "Jack was my light in the darkness. When he died, I thought I couldn't go on." Her hand moved to rest on her stomach. "Then I discovered I was pregnant. This baby. It's all I have left of him." She opened her eyes, looking directly at Dr. David. "That's why this child means everything to me. It's not just my baby. It's Jack's legacy, his final gift to me." Her small hand pressed gently against her abdomen. "When I lost Jack, I thought my world had ended, but this baby gave me a reason to keep living." Maya gently placed her hand on her stomach, her voice softening with maternal tenderness. "This baby is everything I have left of Jack," she whispered. "It's the living proof of our love." Her small fingers traced circles on her abdomen, a gesture both protective and loving. "I'll protect this child with everything I have." The morning light caught the tears in her eyes, making them shimmer. "When I first learned I was pregnant, I knew immediately this wasn't just my baby." She paused, gathering her thoughts. This child is Jack's last hope, his final dream." Her voice grew stronger, despite its softness. "Every night, I talk to the baby. I tell stories about Jack, about how much he would have loved being a father." She shifted slightly in the hospital bed, wincing at the movement but continuing her story. "I tell our baby, your daddy loved you before he even knew about you." A gentle smile touched her lips. "Sometimes, when I'm alone, I imagine Jack sitting beside me, his hand on my stomach, feeling our baby move." Her eyes took on a determined look, despite the exhaustion evident on her face. "I made a promise to Jack," she said firmly. "I promised him I would give our child the best life possible." Her fingers curled protectively around her stomach. "People may stare, they may judge, they may never understand, but I won't give up." The monitor beeped steadily beside her as she continued, her voice growing quieter but no less resolute. "Some people see my size and think I can't be a mother. They don't understand that love isn't measured by how tall you stand or how old you look." She took a deep breath. "This baby is my miracle, my purpose. Through this child, Jack's love lives on." Maya looked out the window at the bright morning sky. "I'll face whatever comes," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "For Jack, for our baby, for the family we dreamed of having together." End of Part 1. Recorded at End of Live, December 17th, 2016. Maya turned to Dr. David, her eyes suddenly clear and determined despite her exhaustion. "Doctor," she said, her voice stronger than before, "Paul is innocent in all of this. He doesn't deserve what's happening to him." Her small hands gripped the bedsheet tightly, knuckles turning white with the effort. The morning sunlight streamed through the window, casting a warm glow across her face as she continued. "When everyone else turned away, Paul helped me. He stood by my side through the darkest moments." Her voice trembled slightly. "All he wanted was to protect me and my baby. That's all he ever tried to do." Dr. David sat quietly, watching as Maya gathered her strength for what she needed to say next. She took a deep breath, her words coming slower now, deliberately chosen. "I know I'm not strong enough to change how people think about me. My appearance will always make them judge first." She blinked back tears. "But please, doctor, help Paul. Tell them the truth about who I am." The monitor beeped softly in the background as Dr. David studied her face. He saw the sincerity in her eyes, the quiet dignity despite her childlike appearance. After a moment, he nodded slowly. "I understand," he said gently, his voice carrying the weight of professional authority. "We'll set things right, Maya. I'll make sure they know the truth." Relief flooded Maya's face, and she sank back against the pillows, exhausted but grateful. The morning light caught the tear rolling down her cheek as she whispered, "Thank you." Meanwhile, across town at the police station, a different scene was unfolding. The small interrogation room hummed with fluorescent light, casting harsh shadows across the metal table, where Paul sat facing two officers. His hands rested quietly on his knees, his posture tired but dignified. "Mr. Paul," the older officer began, his silver hair catching the light, "can you explain why you were with a pregnant child?" His tone carried years of experience, probing but professional. Paul met his gaze steadily. "There's something you need to understand," he said softly. "Maya isn't a child at all." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "She's 26 years old, living with a rare condition called Laron syndrome. It affects her growth, but not her maturity." The younger officer shifted, skepticism written across his face. Paul continued, his voice gaining strength. I know how it looks, but Maya is an adult woman trapped in a child's body. I met her through my work as a sound engineer. When she found herself alone and pregnant, she had nowhere else to turn." His eyes never wavered as he explained. The baby's father was Jack, her fiancé. He died in a car accident 8 months ago, leaving her to face this pregnancy alone. Grief touched his voice briefly. Everyone else turned away when they saw her condition. They judged without understanding. "Our relationship is completely innocent," Paul emphasized, sitting straighter. "I'm simply a friend who chose to help when others wouldn't. Maya needed someone to stand by her, to help her through the hospital visits, to face the stares and whispers." His hands clasped together on the table. "I couldn't walk away knowing she had no one else." The silence stretched as Paul made his final point. "I understand your concerns. I know what people must think." His voice carried absolute conviction now. "But I swear to you, my only intention was to help a pregnant woman in desperate need of support. That's all this has ever been." The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as his words settled in the small room. Paul's face showed nothing but honest determination, patiently waiting as the officers processed his explanation. In the harsh light, his exhaustion was evident, but so was his unwavering certainty in the rightness of his actions. The young officer leaned back in his chair, skepticism etched deep in his features. His fingers drummed a restless pattern on the metal table as he studied Paul with narrowed eyes. "So you expect us to believe she's an adult?" His voice dripped with disbelief. "Everyone who saw her today thought she was a child. Even our most experienced officers thought the same." He leaned forward suddenly. "And you're telling us we're all wrong?" Paul remained steady under the sharp questioning, but before he could respond, the officer pressed on, his tone growing more aggressive. "And if there's nothing between you and her, why risk everything?" His hand sliced through the air for emphasis. "Your reputation, your freedom, all for someone you claim is just a friend?" "Because it was the right thing to do," Paul replied quietly. His voice carried a weight of certainty that made even the skeptical officer pause. Sometimes helping someone matters more than what others might think. The senior officer watched this exchange with growing concern. He raised his hand, cutting off his younger colleague's next question. "That's enough for now." His voice carried the calm authority of experience. The fluorescent lights cast deep shadows across his weathered face as he turned to Paul. "Let's approach this differently," he said, his tone measured and professional. "You mentioned a rare medical condition." He pulled a notepad closer. "Do you have any documentation to support this claim? Medical records, perhaps?" The tension in the room shifted slightly. The younger officer sat back, still radiating skepticism, but the senior officer's more measured approach had changed the atmosphere. Paul's shoulders relaxed slightly, though his expression remained serious. "My lawyer is bringing Maya's complete medical history," Paul replied. "It will confirm everything I've told you." His voice remained steady, confident in the truth of his words. The humming of the fluorescent lights filled the brief silence that followed. Just then, the interrogation room door swung open with precise timing. A well-dressed man in a crisp suit entered, his leather briefcase gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "I'm Paul's attorney," he announced, his voice carrying quiet authority. "And I have the medical documentation you need." He placed a thick folder on the metal table, spreading out several documents with practiced efficiency. "These are Maya's complete medical records," he explained, his finger tracing down key passages. "They detail her diagnosis with Laren's syndrome, her surgical history, and, most importantly, confirmation of her age." The lawyer pulled out a specific page, sliding it toward the senior officer. This medical report clearly shows Maya's internal organs are fully developed, consistent with her actual age of 26. He paused, letting the information sink in. Her condition affects only her external appearance. Any assumptions about her being a minor are medically incorrect. The senior officer studied the documents carefully, his expression shifting from skepticism to consideration. He shared a look with his younger colleague, who still seemed uncertain but remained silent. "These appear legitimate," the older officer finally said, "though we'll need to verify them fully." After a brief discussion in low voices, the senior officer stood. "Mr. Paul, you're free to go for now." His tone remained professional but cautious. "However, stay within the city limits. We may need to question you further as we verify these documents." Paul rose slowly, relief visible in his shoulders, but concern still etched on his face. "Thank you," he said quietly. Then, with more urgency, "Please make sure Maya is protected. She's been through enough already." The younger officer watched Paul leave, doubt still lingering in his eyes. The stack of medical records sat between them on the table, their pages containing the truth that challenged everything they'd initially assumed. At first, the hospital staff kept their distance from Maya. Their eyes held suspicion each time they entered her room. The medical equipment beeped steadily while nurses moved around her bed with careful, measured steps. A young nurse whispered to her colleague as she arranged medical supplies near the window. "I can't believe it," she said softly, glancing at Maya. "How can someone who looks like a child be pregnant? There must be more to this story." Her hands trembled slightly as she organized the instruments. Another nurse nodded, her eyes filled with doubt. "It's hard not to judge," she murmured back. Looking at her, "I just can't make sense of it." They both watched Maya from the corner of their eyes, their movements stiff and uncertain. Everything changed after Dr. David called an emergency staff meeting. The hospital conference room was quiet as he stood before the medical team, his voice calm but firm. "I need to clarify something important about our patient," he began, looking at each person in turn. "Maya is not a child," he explained carefully. "She's a grown woman with Laron syndrome. Our judgments and suspicions only add to her pain." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Our job is simple: to heal and support her. Nothing more, nothing less." The atmosphere in the hospital wing shifted gradually after that meeting. The same young nurse who had whispered doubts now entered Maya's room more frequently. Her steps were lighter, her smile genuine as she checked Maya's blood pressure. "How are you feeling today?" she asked gently. "Is there anything you need?" The clinical distance had disappeared from her voice, replaced by genuine concern. Later that afternoon, another nurse brought a small bouquet of flowers. She placed them carefully on the bedside table, adding a soft touch of color to the sterile room. "These are from all of us in the ward," she said warmly. "We're hoping for your quick recovery." The flowers brightened the room, much like how understanding had brightened the staff's perspective. Where there had been whispers and sideways glances, now there were encouraging smiles and gentle words. The medical equipment still beeped steadily, but the sound seemed less harsh in the transformed atmosphere. Maya noticed the change. The tension in her shoulders eased slightly as nurses came and went, their movements now natural and caring instead of hesitant and judging. The small kindnesses, a gentle touch here, a warm word there, spoke volumes about how understanding had replaced fear and suspicion. The morning light filtered softly through the hospital window. A young nurse entered Maya's room, carrying a warm cup of water. Her footsteps were gentle on the quiet floor as she approached the bed. She placed the cup carefully on the bedside table, her movements slow and deliberate. The nurse looked at Maya with kind eyes and offered a warm smile. "You're the strongest woman I've ever met," she said softly. "No matter what happens, you've fought so bravely through all of this." Her words carried genuine admiration, free from the judgment Maya had grown used to hearing. Maya lifted her head slightly, surprise flickering across her face. Her eyes met the nurse's, searching for any hint of insincerity, but finding none. She remained quiet, unused to such direct kindness from strangers. The morning silence wrapped around them like a gentle blanket. Several minutes passed, filled only with the soft beeping of medical equipment and distant hospital sounds. Maya's fingers played with the edge of her blanket as she gathered her thoughts. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet but full of emotion. "Thank you for saying that," she whispered. "I thought I couldn't do this." Her voice trembled slightly, "but now I know I'm not alone anymore." The words seemed to lift a weight from her shoulders, like sharing a long-held secret. Another nurse, standing nearby, stepped closer to Maya's bed. Her face showed the same gentle understanding as her colleague. "You don't need to explain anything to us," she said warmly. "Just focus on getting better and taking care of your baby. We're here to help you every step of the way." The sincerity in their voices seemed to touch something deep inside Maya. A small, tentative smile appeared on her tired face. Her eyes brightened slightly, like sun breaking through clouds. For the first time since arriving at the hospital, her shoulders relaxed, releasing tension she hadn't realized she was carrying. The morning light grew stronger, warming the room as Maya allowed herself to accept their support. The nurses moved quietly around her, checking monitors and adjusting equipment, their presence no longer clinical but comforting. In this moment of shared understanding, Maya found a small piece of peace she hadn't expected to find within these hospital walls. The afternoon sun slipped through the thin curtains, painting Maya's hospital room in soft golden light. She lay on her side, watching her baby sleep peacefully in the nearby incubator. The steady rise and fall of the tiny chest brought a sense of calm to her own heart. She placed her hand gently over her chest, feeling her heartbeat slow to match her baby's peaceful rhythm. In this quiet moment, Maya reflected on the recent changes around her. The nurses' suspicious glances had transformed into warm smiles. Their cold distance had melted into gentle care. She felt as if she had stepped into a safe haven, a place where she could simply be herself, without explanation or judgment. "I wasn't wrong," she whispered to herself, her voice barely disturbing the peaceful air. "I was right to believe in the goodness in people." The words settled in the golden light like soft dust motes, carrying the weight of truth. Maya turned her gaze back to her sleeping child. Tears of joy gathered in her eyes, but she smiled through them. "My darling," she said softly, her voice filled with mother's love. "Everything will be all right now. Mommy knows, because—" She paused, touching the glass of the incubator gently. "Because we're not fighting this battle alone anymore." The baby stirred slightly, tiny fingers flexing in sleep. Maya watched, mesmerized by every small movement. The afternoon light wrapped around them both like a protective blanket, creating a private world of mother and child. A young nurse appeared in the doorway, holding a chart. She stopped when she saw the scene before her. Maya speaking softly to her baby, the peaceful afternoon light, the intimate moment between mother and child. A smile touched the nurse's lips, and she backed away quietly, unwilling to break the spell of this perfect moment. In the gentle silence, Maya continued her quiet conversation with her baby, their shared peace undisturbed. The hospital sounds seemed distant now, unable to penetrate this bubble of tranquility where a mother and her child found their moment of perfect understanding. Early morning sunlight filtered through the hospital window, casting soft shadows across the floor. Paul pushed the door open gently, holding a small bouquet of fresh flowers. Their soft colors brightened the sterile room as he placed them carefully on the bedside table. His smile was warm and encouraging. "Today's our first day of walking practice," he said softly. "Are you ready?" His voice carried quiet confidence, like he already knew they would succeed. Maya looked up at him, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. She seemed smaller than usual in the hospital bed, her fingers twisting nervously in the sheets. "I don't think I'm strong enough yet." Her voice trembled slightly. Paul's response came with gentle firmness. "I'll be right here," he assured her. "We'll take it slow. There's no rush." His steady presence seemed to fill the room with calm certainty. He bent down carefully, supporting Maya as she swung her legs over the bed's edge. His hands were warm and stable against her shoulders. Maya felt the strength in his grip, not too tight, but secure enough to make her feel safe. Each movement was careful, deliberate. Their first steps were tiny victories. Maya leaned against Paul's arm, finding her balance. The morning light streamed across their path, warming the cold hospital floor. "Don't be afraid," Paul murmured. "Think of each step as a triumph." Maya nodded slightly, her first step wavering but growing steadier. Her small hand gripped Paul's arm tightly, but her determination showed in every movement. Together, they made their way across the room, one careful step at a time. When fatigue began to show on Maya's face, they paused to rest. Paul produced a handkerchief from his pocket, gently dabbing the perspiration from her forehead. His eyes met hers, filled with quiet admiration. "You're stronger than you realize," he said softly. "I knew that from the first time I met you." A blush colored Maya's cheeks, and she lowered her head, avoiding his gaze. But a smile played at the corners of her mouth, impossible to hide completely. The morning light caught the moment, preserving it in golden stillness. As days passed, their walking sessions became moments of shared confidences. Paul told her about his past failures, business ventures that collapsed, relationships that ended too soon. His voice carried no bitterness, only acceptance of lessons learned. Maya listened, offering quiet understanding. In turn, she shared her own story, her love for Jack, the beauty of their brief time together, and her fears of facing the world alone with her child. Her voice would sometimes break, but Paul's steady presence gave her strength to continue. They didn't need many words. Understanding flowed between them in small gestures. The way Paul adjusted his pace to match hers, how Maya's hand found its natural place on his arm, the shared glances that carried volumes of unspoken support. Their connection grew deeper with each session, built on trust and gentle understanding. Every day brought them closer, though neither mentioned it directly. It showed in Paul's attentive care, in Maya's growing trust, in the comfortable silences they shared. The morning light would find them walking together, two souls gradually finding their way towards something neither had expected but both began to cherish. The hospital corridor became their sanctuary, where steps toward physical healing became steps toward emotional connection. In this quiet space, away from judging eyes and harsh opinions, they found a rhythm that belonged only to them, gentle, steady, and full of growing promise. Mr. Thomas sat in his wheelchair near the hospital corridor each day, his weathered hands resting quietly in his lap. From this vantage point, he watched Paul and Maya during their daily walking practices. His eyes, bright with wisdom earned from decades of life, missed nothing. One peaceful afternoon, Maya took slow, careful steps, with Paul's support. The soft sunlight through the windows created long shadows in the corridor. Mr. Thomas smiled gently, turning to a nurse standing nearby. "I've lived long enough to recognize true love when I see it," he said softly. "Look at how he cares for her, as if nothing else in the world matters more than her next step." The nurse watched the pair for a moment, a warm smile spreading across her face. "You're right," she agreed. "Paul never fails to be here when she needs him. I've never seen such dedication." Her eyes followed their slow progress down the hallway. Mr. Thomas nodded, his face reflecting years of understanding. "Love isn't about grand gestures or fancy words," he observed quietly. "It's in the way he guides her steps, accepts every challenge without complaint. That's what real love looks like." Further down the corridor, Maya completed another successful lap. Her face lit up with a small, triumphant smile as she looked up at Paul. "You're doing wonderfully," he encouraged her. "I know you'll go even further tomorrow." They were absorbed in their own world, unaware of the eyes watching them with such warmth. Their simple interaction touched everyone who witnessed it. Other patients paused in their own walks to watch. Nurses exchanged knowing glances. Even the cleaning staff slowed their work to observe the gentle scene unfolding before them. As the session ended, Mr. Thomas watched Paul carefully guide Maya back to her room. The elderly man's face softened with a knowing smile. "I don't know where their path will lead," he murmured to himself, "but I'm certain they'll find happiness together. A connection like that is rare, something precious." The evening light cast long shadows in the corridor as Paul and Maya disappeared around the corner. Mr. Thomas remained in his spot, his heart warmed by what he had witnessed. In his long life, he had seen many kinds of love, but this quiet, steadfast devotion struck him as something special, a reminder that true love often grows in the most unexpected places. The morning sun filled the hospital corridors with golden light. Maya sat in her wheelchair, her baby sleeping peacefully in her arms. Paul stood behind her, his hands resting gently on the wheelchair handles. Their small procession moved slowly through the long hallway. Hospital staff lined both sides of the corridor, their faces warm with genuine affection. The cold professionalism of those first days had melted away completely. A young nurse stepped forward, her smile bright and sincere. "We'll miss you, Maya," she said softly, "wishing you and your baby all the happiness in the world." Dr. David approached them, holding a small picture frame in his hands. His eyes were kind as he presented it to Maya. "This is from all of us," he said warmly, "a reminder that love and courage always triumph in the end." His voice carried the wisdom of someone who had witnessed many victories over adversity. Maya looked down at the photograph, a captured moment from the previous afternoon. There she was with Paul and the baby, surrounded by the smiling hospital staff. Her eyes welled with tears as she traced the frame's edge. "Thank you, doctor," she whispered. "We wouldn't be here today without you. You helped make us a family." As they approached the main entrance, warm sunlight welcomed them. Paul bent down carefully, helping Maya transfer from the wheelchair to the car. His movements were gentle, practiced from their many walking sessions together. Before standing, he squeezed her hand lightly. Paul turned back to look at the hospital one last time. The building stood quiet and dignified in the morning light, forever marked in his memory as the place where their lives had changed, where judgment had turned to understanding, where fear had transformed into hope. Maya's soft voice drew his attention back. "We're starting a new journey, aren't we?" she asked, her words carrying both excitement and slight nervousness. The baby stirred in her arms, as if agreeing. Paul smiled, his eyes meeting hers with certainty. "Yes, we are," he replied gently, "and I'll be right here, with you and our little one, every step of the way." The morning sun caught the moment, wrapping them in its warm embrace as they prepared to leave the past behind and step into their future together. Afternoon sunlight flooded the cozy room, creating warm patterns on the wooden floor. Maya sat at the piano by the window, her fingers dancing lightly over the keys, playing a melody that Jack had once loved. Paul stood nearby, gently cradling their baby, swaying slightly to the music's rhythm. He moved closer, settling beside her on the piano bench. Maya's eyes softened as she watched him with their child. "What do you think about naming him Ethan?" she asked quietly. "Jack always said that would be his choice for a son." Paul nodded, his face gentle with understanding. "I think Jack would be very happy with that," he said softly. The baby stirred in his arms, as if responding to his new name. Rising carefully, Paul placed little Ethan in his crib nearby. Returning to Maya, he surprised her by placing his hands on the piano keys. A simple, sweet melody emerged, not perfect, but filled with warmth. Maya watched him with delighted curiosity. "I didn't know you played," she said, smiling. Paul laughed softly, his shoulders lifting in a modest shrug. "Not like you do," he admitted. "But I know enough to share a song with you." The afternoon light caught the happiness in his eyes. Their hands moved across the keys together, his simple notes complementing her more complex melody. The music filled their small space with joy, creating a moment of perfect harmony. But then, Maya's fingers stilled, and tears gathered in her eyes. "I thought my life was over when Jack died," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "But now, with you and Ethan," she looked up at Paul, her eyes shining. "I've found a new family, a new beginning I never expected." Paul took her hand gently, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "I know I can never replace Jack," he said, his voice steady and sincere. "But I promise you this, I'll do everything in my power to keep you and Ethan happy, always." They returned to the piano, playing together as the afternoon light grew softer. Maya's quiet laughter mixed with the music, creating a perfect lullaby. In his crib, Ethan slept peacefully, surrounded by the gentle sounds of his new family's joy. The scene was simple but profound. A mother at the piano, her new love beside her, their child sleeping nearby, three hearts finding peace together. While somewhere, perhaps, Jack smiled down on the family he had helped create. Time flowed gently forward, bringing change like the shifting seasons. Maya and Paul built a cozy home in the suburbs, filled with music and laughter. Maya transformed their front room into a piano studio where she taught eager students, while Paul returned to his work as a sound engineer. Every evening, without fail, he came home to spend precious time with his family. One golden afternoon, Paul stood in the garden watching through the window as Maya guided Ethan's small hands over the piano keys. At 5 years old, their son had his mother's grace and his father's gentle determination. The same piano that once played Jack's favorite melodies now sang with new life under Ethan's careful touch. "Daddy, look!" Ethan called out, his face glowing with pride. "Mommy says I'm doing really well." His excitement filled the room as Paul stepped inside, ruffling his son's hair affectionately. "I'm sure you'll surpass both of us someday," Paul said warmly, his heart full of love for this child who had brought their family together. Ethan beamed at the praise, his fingers returning eagerly to the keys. Maya watched her husband and son together, happy tears glistening in her eyes. "I don't know what the future holds," she whispered, her voice soft with wonder. "But I'm not afraid anymore." The fear that had once shadowed her days had long since faded, replaced by quiet confidence. Paul wrapped his arm around her shoulders, his voice warm and steady. "We'll face whatever comes together," he assured her. "That's what families do." The simple truth of his words filled the room like sunlight. The evening drew to a close, with all three of them seated at the piano, playing a simple melody together. Ethan sat between his parents, his small hands joining theirs on the keys. The sunset painted their home in shades of gold, a perfect metaphor for the bright future stretching out before them. Their music wasn't just notes on a piano, it was the sound of love, of family, of hope fulfilled. In this moment, they were complete, a family built from loss and found in love, creating their own harmony in the world. Love sees beyond appearances. Maya's story reminds us that true strength often comes in unexpected packages. While the world was quick to judge, those who took time to understand found something beautiful. A mother's courage, a man's unwavering support, and the power of acceptance. Sometimes life's greatest blessings arrive in ways we never imagined. Maya and Paul's journey teaches us that family isn't just about blood or appearances, it's about hearts that choose to love and protect each other. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that love knows no boundaries. Subscribe to hear more extraordinary stories that challenge our perceptions and celebrate the human spirit. Remember, before you judge someone's story, take time to understand it. The truth might surprise you in the most beautiful ways. Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts and what part of Maya's journey moved you the most. Thank you for staying with us through this remarkable story. Until next time, keep your hearts open to life's unexpected miracles. Would you like me to adjust anything about this closing message? Love sees beyond appearances. Maya's story reminds us that true strength often comes in unexpected packages. While the world was quick to judge, those who took time to understand found something beautiful. A mother's courage, a man's unwavering support, and the power of acceptance. Sometimes life's greatest blessings arrive in ways we never imagined. Maya and Paul's journey teaches us that family isn't just about blood or appearances. It's about hearts that choose to love and protect each other. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that love knows no boundaries. Subscribe to hear more extraordinary stories that challenge our perceptions and celebrate the human spirit. Remember, before you judge someone's story, take time to understand it. The truth might surprise you in the most beautiful ways. Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. What part of Maya's journey moved you the most? Thank you for staying with us through this remarkable story. Until next time, keep your hearts open to life's unexpected miracles. Would you like me to adjust anything about this closing message?